My name is Garrett Richards, and I'm an assistant professor with the Environmental Policy Institute at Grenfell Campus. My passions are climate change and renewable energy for the most part. In terms of theoretical areas, I'm keen on science policy interfaces and deliberative democracy. But what I'm really passionate about lately, both for research and teaching, is community engagement. So I started as a teaching assistant some time ago. I'm not even sure of the actual year, but in terms of being an instructor, who's actually the lead for the course, I started in 2014. At Grenfell, the courses that I teach are right now only graduate level courses. I teach 2 core courses for the Environmental Policy Master's Program and 1 core course for the new PhD program in Transdisciplinary Sustainability. So those courses are Environmental Policy 6002, which is a research design and ethics course, in Environmental Policy 6001, which is called Applied Environmental Problem Solving, and in Transdisciplinary Sustainability 7002. It's also a methods class, but we call it Transdisciplinary Methods. I spend a little bit more attention on helping them to apply what they already know, and also thinking a little bit more about the next steps in their career. So trying to get them some really practical experiences and connect them to external partners and other folks that they might work with in the future. So those things are important for undergraduates as well, but I put a little bit more attention on it for graduate students. It also means that teaching is necessarily integrated with research. So first of all, I supervise a number of students in the Master of Arts in Environmental Policy program. So through that supervision, I'm teaching them how to do their research. And sometimes we end up working on collaborative projects together. We might even co-publish something. So the integration there is different than you might see at the undergraduate level. And also in courses. So when we learn how to do research in the research methods and design course, we're thinking about the actual projects that those students will be working on. And even in the problem solving course, we're getting the students to do research for those external partners. So there's an interesting integration there. And one way that I try to bring together all of these different considerations for graduate students is with the Environmental Policy Innovation Lab. To elaborate a little bit on EPI Lab, or the Environmental Policy Innovation Lab, a lot of what we do is each term, that group is made up of research assistants that work with me, plus other students that are interested in EPI Lab as an extracurricular activity. And each assistant is going to be assigned to a project with an external partner. So that partner could be from government, non-government organization, or industry. It'll be something to do with environmental policy where both the student and the partner is interested. In terms of the group, we meet weekly to have some relevant professional development lessons. So I'll talk a little bit about something like community engaged research practices or science policy interfaces or knowledge mobilization or something like that that's relevant to what they do. And they'll provide updates on their projects, and sometimes we'll meet with a guest. So we'll get a liaison from one of the partner organizations to come in and talk to students about that organization. So it's really an opportunity for experiential learning and professional development for those students. In terms of new teaching tools for approaching remote instruction, I'm actually not using a lot of new tools. I used a lot of remote instruction and remote tools even before pandemic times. But one thing that I have been doing differently is, of course, the actual courses have been done virtually. So even though the tool itself is not new to me, hosting entire classes in a remote virtual setting is new. So one thing that I find that I use a lot there is the Brightspace online rooms tool, which you can use for classes, has a multi-user whiteboard. So you can turn that on and then every student can control their cursor and they can type or write or draw on the whiteboard. So that's helps duplicate a lot of what I do in the classroom. So it's nice that I have that interactive tool. And in terms of one other thing, it's not so much a tool, but a strategy. I also schedule more frequent breaks for students because that Zoom fatigue will set in more often. So I usually schedule at least 2 breaks in a 3-hour class. And we try to do a little bit more individual work so I can give them something they go off to do and we come back to talk as a group. And I try to keep things light. So sometimes we'll do an activity that I call a brain stretch, where we just brainstorm about something that is only tangentially related to what we're talking about. In terms of communicating with my students during pandemic times, I mostly use the same technology that I would have used before. So even when classes were in person, I generally preferred email. I would schedule regular meetings with the students that I supervised. Those would happen in my office. Now they just happen in virtual meetings, but the essential structure and nature of the engagement is the same. But one thing that I do a lot differently to accommodate for the remote setting is that I'm a lot more flexible with how I manage my expectations around things like student attendance and participation. So attendance I track, but I no longer give marks for. So when classes were in person, you could lose marks for not showing up for class and not telling me why you weren't there. But now you can't, because maybe your internet is just out, or maybe you're an international student and internet just isn't reliable in your area. So I don't require that anymore. Students can't earn participation marks unless they're there. So there's still an incentive to attend. And of course, it's easier to engage in a class when you're there live rather than just viewing the recording. But students can get a maximum participation mark just by viewing recordings and participating online if they needed to. No one's had to quite take it to that extreme, but I do have flexibility there. And I also record the classes so that those students that might not have a reliable connection can still download and view the recording and participate that way. So not really a difference in the tools that I'm familiar with and the tools that I use, but a difference in my expectations around what students can manage during these times. One success I can identify is that I think for extracurricular opportunities, things like the Environmental Policy Innovation Lab and some of the other activities that I do, regular meetings for students that are interested in learning more about government and politics or talking about writing strategies and tools, I find attendance is actually better for those than it was when we were doing those things in person. And I think it has something to do with those extracurricular activities. There's just less of a barrier for students to attend. If they would normally have to come to school on a Monday and they don't have classes to come to one of those extracurricular opportunities, they no longer actually have to make the trip to campus. And I think in particular, second year students in our master's program who are all done their coursework and typically don't come to campus, even during pre-pandemic times, it's just a lot easier to engage them with virtual tools. So probably when things go back to normal, I'll continue to use some of those virtual tools because it seems to be good for attendance in extracurricular activities. One thing I've learned from this experience in remote teaching is that student feedback is actually more critical now than it was before, because they're the ones that are experiencing the greatest hardships when it comes to engaging with the class. They're the ones who have to sit through sort of 3 hours of online activities, and that can be very fatiguing. So their feedback is really valuable. And a couple of things they told me have been those amazing lessons. So one thing they said is, when a break is scheduled in the calendar, something like a Thanksgiving break or a reading week, they need it to be a true break. So it doesn't help them if we expect that break to be something where they're going to do a lot of out-of-class work. So I altered the way I scheduled things for this term, and I collaborated with other instructors in the environmental policy program to make sure we didn't have major papers due right after the break. And then one thing that's maybe even more exciting is students often say that they don't feel connected to each other and to the programs and to the university. They just don't have a space to make that connection. So one thing we came up with was I decided that after each of my classes, I would just leave the meeting open, and I would either exit the meeting or I would turn down my volume or take out my headphones so that I couldn't hear what students were talking about, but they could engage with each other. I was still there. If someone needed to ask a question, they could type it in the chat, but it became a place where they could just connect with each other like they normally would in a classroom setting after class. And we don't often think about making that sort of opportunity, but students were the ones that suggested that. And the couple of times that I've been able to implement it, they really took advantage. Some advice that I would give to students about remote learning is, and this is difficult because students will understand their own limitations and perspective a lot better than I do. But my general advice is that to the extent that you can, replicate the typical structure of learning as much as you can. So this is both in terms of time and physical space. So that means creating a workspace in your home. So if you have a separate room that you can use as a workspace, that's ideal. If you're in a smaller place, even a corner where you go to sit at a certain desk and do your work at certain times, it matters. And then when you're using your computer for other things, put it somewhere else. Create all of those psychological cues that cue you up to learn that you would normally have in the classroom. And it takes a little while to establish that. I know, because it's true for me as well. It takes about a week to get used to each lockdown period and get back to sort of my same level of productivity. But those associations and cues do build. And also in terms of time. So schedule work time where things are ideally going to be uninterrupted and you can concentrate. And I know there's limitations to that if you have kids and you're sharing your home, or you have a partner who's also doing work or school. But to the extent that you can, try to create that structure, because in my view, you need that structure. You need that devoted space and time in order to concentrate on your studies.